All right. So first item or the next item on the agenda is the discussion of the agenda. Does anybody, I assume everybody has a copy. Does anybody have any questions, comments, concerns, discussion items regarding the agenda? Nope. All right. So the minutes. Any discussion of the minutes? Again, because this is a workshop, we can't actually vote to adopt the minutes, but we can discuss them if we have any questions or concerns. If we want to make any amendments or corrections to those minutes, we can do that and then stick it on the stack of items for our in-person meeting. Nope. All right, minutes look good to go for us. And that makes the next item is all you. So update on liaison action items.
Sure. So the first one I think is that dashboard. We've had conversations internally with staff about what kind of data they would like to see on that or what they think is appropriate. And I did not get any responses yet from the CCAC. So still looking out for responses from you all for what you think you would like to see. I did also find a great example of what we are maybe looking for, and that's actually through the EPA's website that I was looking at earlier today.
Can you send us out a link so that we kind of have an idea?
I certainly will.
Because it's not entirely clear to me, and maybe this is the input that you're looking for from us. Is this? I've seen dashboards where they're greenhouse gas inventory dashboards. In terms of a climate dashboard, I definitely think the greenhouse gas inventory, once it's completed, should be a part of that. Are you suggesting, or has staff been discussing, putting our climate action plan items up on the dashboard in some capacity? I'm just not really clear how what we're doing is making ultimately sort of policy suggestions or recommendations, how that fits into a dashboard format.
Yeah, so certainly I think what would be easy to model is that the greenhouse gas dashboard and data presentation that you see in places. And that was one of the things I was going to bring up from the EPA. But I think this is an opportunity also for staff and you all to add to that. Does that speak to you, or does that data as presented in other places speak to these threats or these priority areas that you are all looking at? And are there other data points that maybe does a better job of that? So just really an opportunity, an inflection point here.
Well, I'll open it up. Does anybody on the committee have thoughts about that? What they'd like to see on a climate dashboard?
I just had kind of the similar comment as Megan, that I wasn't exactly sure. But in my head, I envisioned maybe if we come up with strategies and the city and county are working on initiatives, they could be listed there to see that work is being done. But I admit that I didn't look up examples. So maybe if I saw examples, it might help.
Thanks, Amanda. Anybody else?
I just agree with that. Examples would be helpful to think more clearly about what we want on there.
Sounds good. Yeah, Forrest, you said you had the one from the EPA. Can you send that along? And then if there's any others that you all have been kind of tossing around as examples, pass them on, just to give us kind of a framework to be thinking about this would be helpful.
Absolutely. There's a host.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. We have GRU, UAB.
Yeah, so similar, we did get a series of questions from some of you, but not everyone. Still going to, the floor is still open for you all if you want to send in some questions for the Utility Advisory Board or for GRU. But I'm sending the questions that we did receive forward so that we can start working with them on getting those answers. Also, just in Sort of a general update is that the staff on the county side have been prompted to start looking at doing an update for the greenhouse gas inventory and going back to a lot of the data that we already have and that we collected back in 2008, 9, and 10. Just to bring all of that back up to date. So that's where we are with that, still moving forward with that and coordinating on that. So definitely, if you all have those questions, send them to me and they'll be added to the list that we have going right now.
Sounds good. Yeah, it's kind of part of the next steps. Item 6B, I think I kind of offer my suggestions on the GHGI, but as you all are talking about that, I think it'd be really helpful for us as a committee to be able to see an outline, like what scopes, what's the scope of the GHGI that you all are looking at doing, how granular of the data are you going to be able to get? Are there sectors or portions of the GHGI that you're just not going to be able to get at? Are there some sort of aspirational where it's maybe a more difficult ask, but you think that you really have a chance of capturing that data? And then a timeline so that we have some idea of when that would be completed. And if it's something where you all are able to send out various the energy sector is usually one that's a little easier to get at because it comes mostly from a utility, so the data's in one place.
Sure.
So if you can send it out piecemeal, even in terms of the timeline, that would also be helpful for us, I think.
Yeah, certainly. And yes, the last go round, that in of itself was a very large undertaking and had a lot going on with it. So there's a lot of data, a lot of things that have moved on that, and it's doing it again, of course, would be a whole lot of moving parts and pieces. And if that is where you all see yourselves as offering advice as this moves on, as a new GHGI, process is undertaken, then that, I think that's where staff already assumed you would be. But yeah, we'll keep updating and give you all the opportunity to guide that process and provide your input to that process, similar to the vulnerability analysis.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. I think that is something that we would want to be involved in since it relates directly to the climate action plan. And especially with regards to scope. I mean, when we talk about, you can look at scopes, just your local emissions, or are we actually going to stretch and try to look at some life cycle emissions issues, which that's a much bigger project, but it's also a much more holistic approach. So I think that I at least, and I'd be interested in input from the rest of the committee, but I at least would be interested in being part of that conversation. Anybody else? I'm seeing kind of smiles. Good.
Oh, it looks like John, you're not, or you are muted, John. Why don't you
John, you're
go
still
first?
muted.
Yes, I would like to be a part of that also.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think last go round, the 2008-9 or so, I may be incorrect about this, but I think it was probably more staff intensive than you are all thinking. So if that is not the way that you all are envisioning going forward, now is the time. And then of course, going forward, there will be more time to keep interjecting yourselves to guide that so that it is more, or so that it's less of a staff intensive process, if that's what is appropriate.
Yeah, I think we want to be part of helps, to set sort of the guidelines and the framework. Sorry, John, go ahead.
I was just saying part of the planning.
Yeah, you all are welcome to the data crunching. Okay.
No, that's good. I mean, that really, in sincerity, that's what staff likes, and that's the kind of direction that we need. You know, we'll go down the road that we know is correct, but we also need you all to tell us what to look at.
Sounds good. All right, Monday meetings.
Yeah, so just as a reminder, just so that because it is a little awkward for these advisory committee meetings to have offset meetings and to have 2 per month, but that's all been confirmed. So we're having the Thursday meeting and the Monday meetings now going forward until you all decide to do something different. I will be in the physical space in the conference room on the Thursdays. Brandy will be in the physical space on the Mondays. But we're required as county staff to have at least one person here present. So if for whatever reason or the time is right that there are physical in-person meeting needs, we're here for that. But yeah, those are scheduled, and we've got the February 22nd meeting. That notification already went out to our county staff today, so that one is set. And we're ready and moving forward with that schedule.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thank you for putting that together. And I'm glad that nothing else conflicted with those Mondays.
The only thing to consider or just be aware of is that sometimes those joint water and climate policy board meetings are on those Mondays every other month that happen earlier in that day, which actually, you know, sometimes may be really beneficial, but they shouldn't really conflict or overlap, and actually sometimes they may dovetail pretty nicely.
Well, it would definitely give us an opportunity to give a fresh update after the joint policy board meeting to bring it back to CCAC.
Yeah.
All right. Next on the agenda, Zero Waste Week update. Amanda, I believe that is you.
Yeah, and I have to say, Amanda, you know, I didn't give you too much of a heads up on this one, so we didn't get
Of course, really?
Yeah, that's on me.
Sorry, if you don't want to go, you don't have to go. If you're comfortable speaking to it, we would appreciate an update.
Oh, no, that's fine. I watched the recording, so, and I looked at the agenda. I had a little warning. Yeah, so it was the last week of January. It's the second year we've done that, and the goal is to just raise awareness and increase the groundswell to move our community towards zero waste. And obviously this year was different than last year. Everything was online, and we created a system where if you signed up, you got a newsletter for 7 days. And it took you to the website where we had education, action items, stuff you could actually do, like letters you could take and have them be from yourself, but they were about something specific related to zero waste. I presented 3 live Zooms, and that's why I didn't make it to that Thursday's meeting 2 weeks ago. 2 of them were on reducing wasted food and composting, which is a really big deal with zero waste and really important to me. And the other one was on post-screening discussion I led on the story of plastic. So I'm a core member of Break Free from Plastic, so I'm able to schedule those viewings or screenings of that film. And so I had that open last week, and then we did a post-screening discussion. Yeah, I think it overall went really well. We had over 400 people sign up for it, and yeah, it was good. Thank you for asking.
Thanks,
Thank you
Amanda.
for sharing.
It was a big deal on staff side too. I can tell you, there was a lot of buzz and a lot of people moving around for that whole week.
Good. Well, it definitely is a collective effort, zero waste. We need community members, city and county staff, people who work in businesses, the schools. We need everybody involved. It's a big culture shift, and that's a big deal. So we're trying to change the culture from disposable to one where we value resources, and that's a big deal. So we need everybody on board.
Yeah, well, and it's definitely going to play into the climate action plan as well.
Mm-hmm.
So can I ask a question? It's sort of, I mean, we don't know how long COVID times are going to last, and we don't necessarily know whether things will go back to normal. How, from a zero waste perspective, how do we deal with the new emphasis on disposables from a like a sanitation standpoint, right? I mean, there's much more of a push to use, single-use items because they've been sealed. I know that I haven't eaten in a restaurant in almost a year, and every time I take my carryout waste to my trash, it breaks a little part of me. It's like really, really frustrating. Do you have any insight on that, or any thoughts on that?
Right. So that's really a big deal, and it's a huge question, and it's what a lot of people are trying to figure out and think of. One thing, bottom line, is that restaurants have regulations to sanitize their reusables, whether if they're dishes and cups and everything, that really work for any bacteria or virus as long as they're following the standards of the 3-bin system or the commercial dishwasher. If that's up to standard, that should be fine with cleaning everything. And then if people are carrying a plate or a cup to you, whether if it's single use or reusable, there's no difference there as far as people touching those. So certain industries have pushed single use during COVID for certain reasons. And then there are other groups that have banded together to push reusables and got scientists and data behind that. And so there's been kind of this back and forth. So bottom line is that, even though a lot of areas that had single-use plastic bans or things changed in the restaurant system as far as a foodware ordinance, because that's a big one I've been talking about here for about 6 months. Those things have been put on hold temporarily. Some have gotten going back again. Behind the scenes, like the national groups I'm in and the calls that we're on, we're organizing for what we're calling, really, we want a just recovery for people and the planet. So sometimes, we might be thinking more about the planet, and we're really not, but that can be perceived. So I guess the just recovery is realizing that our frontline workers aren't just fire, police, and rescue, which are all great, but also the grocery store workers, the people in the restaurants and delivery system. So they should be considered coming out of this recovery, as well as disposable stuff, the utensils and everything. So I guess that's how we're trying to move forward, the groups that I'm on and I'm with. And even though some things are paused and maybe there is more disposables right now, I don't think it will last forever.
I hope so.
Right.
I mean, but that's also something that, as we do our climate action plan, we're going to be crossing, the COVID times and hopefully going into a future without. So it's something we'll have to consider. John, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to also amend, I've heard you say that all disposables aren't the same, right? Depending on the material it's made out of.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm.
So degrees matter, nuance matters.
Yes, yeah. Degrees matter, but definitely reusables are better than disposable in general. But yes, there are degrees of, it's the precautionary principles. If we banned something and they moved on to something else, it could be still just as bad in some ways, but there are less bad disposables, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else have questions for Amanda about zero waste? No? All right, thank you. So this next bit was kind of the meat of getting CCAC as a whole moving forward. So yeah, it's unfortunate we don't have the whole committee here to do this, but let's see what we can do with us. I'm going to try to do a screen share here. Forrest, do I have permission? I mean, I have the button. Do I have permission to do this based on the Zoom settings? All right, cool.
Good. I think we found out that everybody has all the settings.
All right, let's see. You guys, can you see it? We good? All right. So basically, this is our homework for ourselves last time was to do this sort of high pass vulnerability analysis where we look at the exposures that North Central Florida is going to expect with a changing climate, then look at the impacts and the concerns that follow from that. So the idea here is that we each came up with our top 3 exposures, and those exposures are big scale. So increasing temperatures, intensification of the hydrologic cycle, that sort of thing. But each of those lead to different impacts, and those impacts are associated with different vulnerabilities or different concerns. So what I was hoping that we can do here is we have a conversation where each of us discusses our top 3 impacts. So we have this high level, the exposure, each exposure is associated with multiple impacts, and each impact may be associated with 1 or more vulnerabilities. So the idea here is to give your top 3 impacts. So based on the probability or the likelihood of this impact coming to pass, the immediacy, is this something that we're seeing right now? Is it something that we expect to see in the next 5 years? Or is it something, 10 or 20 years down the line? And then finally, the magnitude or the breadth of the impact. And so once we've all discussed what we think our top 3 impacts are, and this is, to be clear, this is not the top 3, the only 3. This is just our starting point. We need a place to start. We're going to be standing up our communications plan. We're going to be going out into the community. This is just the first 3 things or 5 things that we are going to tackle, and then it's going to be iterative. And we'll kind of talk a little bit more later about what that looks like, or at least how I foresee that looking like. Obviously, if you all have different ideas or better ideas, I am completely open to those. So for now, if you all have kind of put some thought into this, I'd like to open it up and hear what you consider to be your top 3 impacts, and see where we have agreement, where maybe we're not all on the same page, and from there we can narrow it down and pick I was saying a top 5, where that's just our first batch. That's the first set of things that we're going to tackle. All right, we've all seen this. Can I take this down now? It's really weird with the dual monitor setup. Like, where I want to look is way up here, and then I can't really see you all. All right, are we good to stop sharing? There we go. All right, you all right, Macs do not like Zoom. Hold on a second.
It looks fine on this end.
Does it? Because I cannot see any of you. The dual monitors are now just reflecting one single monitor. Let's see. Oh, there we go. All right. Good to go. So who would like to start? Nobody. Anybody? If you all haven't done it, you can be honest. This is not like we actually have a class and homework. There's not an actual grade involved with this.
Yeah, recognizing oh, John, we did it again. Do you want to go first? Were you going to say something, John?
I won't start, but
If you want to. Gentlemen first.
Yeah.
I wanted to just fit in one that was, I call natural space destruction, or the, or basically providing natural spaces that would not be destroyed with weather changes, due to, and this would prohibit wildlife and forests from producing the oxygen and the wetlands for providing the clean water that we need. So mine was natural spaces destruction due to weather changes.
All right. Were there any others, or is that like your big takeaway?
Well, my other one was environmental justice, the impact of some groups getting more impact of weather changes and impacting their lifestyle versus others. And I call that environmental justice, injustice.
I'm taking notes. All
I have,
right.
I have a quick question for John. Would you also consider environmental injustice to be environmental? I'm pretty sure like a term I've used in my courses is environmental racism, and the fact that like let's say poorer communities or communities on like the fringe of urban areas are more likely to be subject to worse environmental conditions, such as like being next to like Superfund sites or factories, and like experience worse water quality and air quality. So I just wanted to see if that was like along the lines of what you meant by environmental injustice.
Yes, Cayman, that's exactly a injustice and racism are kind of the same thing, and it would be due to things like you're saying, actually locating of chemical areas and factories, and locating of dumping waste and things in certain areas. Actually moving from a high development area over to a less developed area of the spoils of the environment, of the community.
All right, great. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Amanda, is your hand up? You gonna take a crack at it?
Yes, but Jennison wanted to go. So if
Oh, all right.
if you want to go first, that's fine.
It doesn't matter. Although, so I'm not good at picking a very narrow impact or exposure or impacts. It's hard for me to think about them all individually because they're so overlapping and intersectional. But I think building on John's comment about climate justice being at the core, some of the most critical impacts I think about are housing security and how that's going to be affected not only by affordability, but by in migration from coastal areas of Florida, or how our population is going to be growing, and that pressure that's already there, the upward pressure, on housing prices and just people's ability to survive in their home or to have a roof over their heads. And then the food justice piece that goes along with that, and how the variability in extreme weather events, drought, pressure on our freshwater supplies and aquifers is going to affect our ability for local farmers to provide, provide food and produce, but also how that's going to kind of, as COVID has done, disrupt the supply chains and increase prices for everybody across the board. So at the end of the line, though, that impact, I think, is, it all comes down to equity and food security, housing security, and public health also comes up, like thinking about vulnerability to heat stress, and the communities and individuals within our community who are most vulnerable to those who already have pre-existing health conditions. And with this increasing extremes, we're going to have to deal with that more and more. So I don't know if that captures. I know it's hard to list it as individual ones, but and the climate justice, while we're talking about that, there's the Climate Justice Alliance that does work with like 74 climate justice coalitions with Indigenous, Black communities all around the country. Is another great resource for us to look to for that.
That's good. So I'm hearing from both of you that you want the first impacts, and you're kind of thinking about these differently than I am, and that's okay. I'm just trying to like switch gears here. But in terms of the impacts, I'm hearing from both of you that you want to focus, or you think we should focus on the impacts that directly relate to climate justice and to climate equity. So in terms of what we address, we should go for those that have the biggest impacts on equity first. Is that fair to say? Yeah, okay.
And along those lines, what I'm hearing as staff also, that what specifically falls under that equity and justice issue are food security, housing security, and public health. So those, of course, that environmental justice and climate justice would be that exposure maybe level that you're talking about, Megan. But this housing security, public health, heat stress specifically are fall under that. So I think that's a good approach for one of those.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, it's justice, but at the end of the day, in terms of exposure, it's thinking about how we can best protect and more equitably allocate these basic resources that we need to survive. So our freshwater resources, looking at equity through the lens of, the highest and best use of those freshwater supplies and how are we currently using those, right? And then also the same from an energy perspective. Obviously, we want to reduce our greenhouse gas footprints, but if that's gonna, it's not an either or. We also have to do that in a way that considers the financial impact on those least able to afford, more expensive energy at the end of the day, the housing bills or energy bills. So
Thanks, Jennison. Amanda, you ready to go?
Sure. So I guess I wanted to say a couple things first, just to catch up from last week, is that I would say that I should be on the technical team when you guys were kind of dividing up teams or responsibilities, but of course, communication as needed. And then definitely my skill set is in waste reductions and organic systems, keeping resources local, and plastic pollution prevention. And so I just wanted to catch up because you guys talked about that last week. And then the 3 areas of priority, I wasn't quite sure exactly this system based on the information, but I definitely, my top one that I think I could contribute to that I also think is very important is just a comprehensive organics program. So that would really cover everything from reducing wasted food and making the connection to excess food to the food insecure, edible food rescue, all the way to systems on the back end of keeping all compostable organic material out of the landfill. Food scraps for sure, but vegetation and soil paper. So everything that goes to the landfill that contributes to the methane there. And I wanted to bring up a question that I had for the group, and I wasn't sure how you guys think about this. So with the zero waste work I do, it intersects climate a good bit, but it's not always local. So for example, I do a lot on plastic pollution prevention, and I'm involved in getting the education and outreach out on how plastics contribute to climate change throughout their whole life cycle. And specifically in Louisiana, I gave a talk today at a UF class on environmental justice, and I talked about plastic pollution, environmental justice, and more on the plastic production. And so I did a whole case study on Cancer Alley and how the plastics factories there are trying to build, but the grassroots group are stopping them. And a lot of what we want with zero waste systems and zero waste communities locally is to prevent problematic material from coming in our community. And a lot of that is plastics. But if we were able to do that on so many levels, the climate change mitigation wouldn't be seen here. It would be, if communities across the country did this, it would mean those factories would shut down and wouldn't be emitting those climate polluting emissions. So, but the same with our waste goes to Union County, to that landfill. So that's even out of our county, even though it's only like 33 miles away. And waste reduction in general is another priority to me, and keeping resources local, like reusables, again, and the food scraps to create a soil amendment. But the methane is a county away. So I don't know how you guys feel about that, because possibly where I can contribute, or even what I do day to day, doesn't necessarily reduce climate change in Alachua County.
As you were talking, and even before you started talking, Amanda, this reminded me of a local action tied to zero waste that I don't think we've really talked about before, but it's about the shared economy, like moving away from, this consumer-based, like long supply chains, not only to a local economy, but to the shared economy, and where our potential is to reduce our greenhouse gas footprint there by promoting that, and also address economic justice and equity at the same time. So I'm not sure how that fits in terms of exposure and impact, but trying to, like, to the extent that we have local rule over trying to create those shared economy incentives, for things like, at a neighborhood scale, sharing electric powered lawn equipment rather than everybody going out and buying their own lawnmower, and things like that, just simple things.
Yeah, and that is definitely part of zero waste. Really emphasizing local, like keeping resources local, like I mentioned, and that is across the board with food, like obviously growing food here and having it availability to us, but then why on earth would we send food scraps to a landfill or any organic vegetation and stuff like that when that's a resource here? So zero waste is about, closing that loop and building up the local system so we have local self-reliance, a lot like that. Yeah, definitely.
Thanks, Amanda.
And Amanda, you and I have talked about it a little bit also, and maybe you and Gus are more apt to speak about this, but just the emissions associated alone with trucking waste to Union County or to other areas is a major component.
Yes.
I also think that the zero waste comes in, you say that it may not be just, that may not have such a strong effect on climate change locally, but I think, to that earlier conversation about the scope of the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, I mean, when you start looking at zero waste and you start considering closing the cycle, the less new goods or new products that we're consuming, that actually reduces the embodied energy associated with those products tremendously. So I think that when we start to think a bit more from a systems perspective about climate change, that connection, that relevancy becomes a lot more clear.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And my third suggestion, although I realize that these probably won't make the top, but except maybe the food systems, I think that we definitely have to work on an comprehensive organic program. But my third suggestion would just be that overconsumption aspect of poorly made goods is unsustainable, and that's really directly contributing to climate change. And that's really a difficult one to tackle. It's definitely something that intersects with zero waste, and we always recommend buying, less stuff, durable stuff, and used items, and buying as close to home as possible. So less travel. That's a tough one when you're talking about people's personal consumption habits, and also the fact that it's based on our system of capitalism, where kind of like where Nancy Darren talks about how we recognize growth and a productive community is when we're all spending a lot of money on stuff. Maybe that's not the right way to measure things, and that really intersects with zero waste systems. So just throwing that out there. But I feel most strongly about working on an comprehensive organics program that really deals with good local food systems, emphasizing buying local food, and keeping organic compostable material out of the landfill. We just really need to do that for so many reasons, but climate reasons as well.
Thanks, Amanda. Forrest, are you raising your hand? Okay.
Amanda, I've got, when I started taking notes, I've got waste reduction and then actually consumption or overconsumption as the same bullet point. Would you separate those out? Would you have waste reduction as one thing and then overconsumption as something that should be approached separately? In my mind, they're connected.
They're absolutely connected. I guess the only reason I separated them out is because I feel like waste reduction it's very broad and it covers a lot, but the waste reduction and the comprehensive organics program, both of those overlap in the fact that I think one priority with both of those is keeping resources local and in use. So in the organics, that's talking about the food scraps that can create a soil amendment that can help our soils locally. And the waste reduction with keeping resources local is, we shouldn't be throwing away, nothing should go to the landfill as far as if it can be mechanically recycled effectively, reusable, durable goods, those kind of things. So I guess those overlap in that way, but then waste reduction and overconsumption do overlap in other ways. So yes, you're absolutely right.
Okay.
But if I could add, I see those as definitely connected, but also very distinct problems or challenges, because the waste comes in along that consumption chain or process, whereas I think about overconsumption being it's that economic capitalist system that we live within, and the planned obsolescence essentially that's baked into so many of our goods and services, that then GDP says we are doing a good thing if we're buying more and consuming more. So I kind of see that overconsumption as a foundational element that we can tackle through things like, a closed circular economy, shared economy, like alternative approaches that really emphasize the value of what you're consuming as opposed to the quantity and the price tag on what you're consuming, and the durability, and emphasize that durability. And I think that's something that the communications and outreach, we have a long way to go. But we can also, like in a course that that I work on, this is like the first thing we start with, which is helping people like think about what they spend their money on and how much value they're getting out of it, and then the value they get out of things that they don't spend money on, you know, and just like trying to back away from that consumer based mindset that our quality of life is coming from that consumption. And so yeah, I mean, they're definitely connected. I'm not saying they're not, but I do think it's that tackling them, we have to come at it from different angles.
I'll echo that. I think, yeah, they're absolutely connected, but overconsumption to me, like, I think of that more as choosing what you purchase, and waste reduction is choosing how you dispose of something once you've already purchased it or brought it into your life in some way.
Oh, and I meant to give a really concrete example, which is some of the recent studies in the last couple of years looking at kind of life cycle impacts of your food choices have shown that what you choose to eat actually has a much larger effect on greenhouse gas emissions. So your dietary choices than actually like where the food comes from, or, you know, I mean, it's not a definitive, it's definitely depends on where you live and what your diet is, but there's like a lot of evidence saying, you know, you want to make that significant change with your food footprint, look at what you're eating, you know, is just as important as where you're buying it from, which I'm not saying it's right or wrong, because it gets messy then with people saying, oh, well, then we don't need to eat locally, you know, and that's not what matters. It's eating lower on the food chain, but that's an example of like that initial decision of what you're consuming versus the waste that comes along with that. I can share those studies too.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have something on kind of like on waste, on sort of what Amanda was talking about? If not, Megan, you want to hit us with what you've got?
Mine focused more, I think, on this. I think a lot of the same things everybody else discussed. I really liked your synopsis of it, Megan, about focusing on how social justice plays out in these issues. I had been thinking about, you know, changes in storm intensity and frequency and how that impacts our local area in terms of growing seasons and increased temperature and people who are exposed to being out in those types of environments and things like that, just exposed to the elements and those big changes and a lot of what comes with that. So my line of thinking was very much covered with everybody's discussion on the idea of starting with social justice issues first. I think that I think we have a responsibility to start there as opposed to anywhere else.
Thank you. Yeah, so I said, you all kind of thought of impacts differently than I did. And then I realized it's kind of come full circle, which is really cool. So mine that I came up with are ones that we've actually already talked about. So one of my impacts was increasingly frequent, dangerously high heat indices during the day and increasingly frequent warm nights. And the reason that I put that as a main priority was for potential heat stress and heat stroke for people who work outside, increased energy use due to air conditioning loads and the impacts both on our energy use, our greenhouse gas emissions, and then as well as cost, especially for low income residents. That people will be less inclined or less able to use non-vehicular modes of transportation. It stinks to walk outside in July at noon on a sidewalk with no trees. And then finally, heat stress on livestock, on some of our local livestock. So that was one of them, the temperatures. I also had one of my main impacts, agricultural issues, so changes to growing season and hardiness zones and the consequent impacts on our ability to produce food locally. And then what was my third one? Third one was what Megan just mentioned, was increasing intensity and frequency of storm events, whether those are tropical cyclones or severe local storms, or even non-severe, or just really heavy rain-making storms, with impacts to flooding, residential, commercial, industrial. And again, I'd be interested if the city has data on this, but anecdotally, it seems like hail plantation doesn't flood nearly as much as our poor neighborhoods do. So again, I think that flooding tends to disproportionately impact people who are already disadvantaged in our community. Street flooding in terms of transportation disruptions, pollutant runoff into surface and groundwater, and then just sort of critical infrastructure, key resources type concerns. So those are my three, and everybody else has touched on it already. I really, really like the idea of tying it all together with social justice and climate equity, though. So I don't know, Forrest, if there's, I guess that's, can we narrow, are you guys down for a discussion of kind of narrowing this down a little bit? Or Forrest, do you feel like you have that information, you could put something together and then send it out to everybody afterwards?
I do actually. I think, it seems like there have been a lot of maybe different topics, but I do think that a lot of them come directly under environmental justice and social justice, climate justice. And I think that area will sort of lend itself nicely into several different tasks going forward, although it's one big approach. Then I also have green infrastructure, the natural space preservation, conservation that John brought up, the comprehensive organics program, and then I have waste consumption reduction. I have that as one. Again, I'm willing to separate that out into two, but that in my mind maybe is a good approach to keep together at this point. So that I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I think that's.
I think that we should also, I think it was Jennison also mentioned housing. I think that looking at housing kind of comprehensively will allow us to also address some of those questions about also looking at increasing utility costs, like that can be rolled into questions of housing.
That one I had under the social justice, but it may be important to bring that out as its own topic and its own entity. I know that is very important on the county commission side. Our commissioners are speaking about it. They just did on Tuesday, just made a motion. And of course, affordable housing on the city side has been an important topic for quite some time.
And I know Stephen's been bringing up transportation as well. After our last meeting, the whole issue with mopeds on campus came up because, they did that trying to decrease cars on campus, and all they did was decrease the number of students riding the bus. And, they don't have carburetors, so their emissions are not regulated the same way cars are, and they create many, many, many hazards, both climate change wise and just personal safety. So I know that public transit was one of the issues because, how do we do that safely in times of COVID and just in general make our public transit system more user friendly so that people will use it. We talked about that today, that anybody from the east side of Gainesville can't get to our museum without taking 5 buses. So they lose the opportunity to come visit us because who's got time for that? So apparently there are some discussions happening in this city about that, and would be something interesting for us to think about as well.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Megan, because I was just going to channel a colleague of mine in terms of how we might communicate and capture these, and transportation being one of those areas we hadn't talked about, and the opportunities for both efficiency and waste in developing our public transit system and also addressing, well, most importantly, addressing the equity piece, that, and so channeling my colleague, Hal Knowles, he thinks he would say, we need to look at how we dwell, how we eat, how we move, and what am I forgetting? How we thrive, commune, but basically like the, food, housing, and transportation as top like action categories, and making sure that justice thread runs throughout. But in terms of the affordable housing piece for us, that's why I wanted to make sure we got that in there, as instead of being under an umbrella, that housing, they're really tangible, not just housing, but buildings in general, tangible actions that we as a community can take in the climate action plan.
And Jennison, you reminded me that it's not just about transportation, but also like our greenways and our bike paths, because Gainesville claims to be a bike safe city, but it's only bike safe if you're right next to campus and not going on any main roads. So thinking about how do we make multiple forms of transit safe and effective through town.
Yeah.
I think I got it. Transportation as its own separate, and then housing, I agree, as its separate approach. Still social justice, climate justice as its separate sort of entity that we're going to attack, but of course that housing and transportation is directly related to that.
Well, I don't know that it's social equity or social or climate justice are separate. I mean, I think they're kind of like, that's the approach that we're taking. Like that's the lens through which we are looking at all of these things. So it's not, I don't see it as being like a separate thing. I see it as being a component of all of these issues that we've talked about so far. Okay. So when we talk about, transportation, the way that we're viewing transportation, especially for this first pass, like what we're prioritizing for our first action is looking at transportation from the lens of equity. And how do we, to the point of like people who live in East Gainesville can't even get to the museum without taking 5 buses, so how do we make those resources accessible to people in our community who don't currently have access? And then, when we look at transportation, you look at, say, in-migration, someone mentioned that earlier, we're going to have more and more people coming here. So how do we make sure that public transportation network is able to serve new people coming in, not, people who live here now, but how do we make ourselves a welcoming community going forward? So, I don't know. I don't see social justice or equity as its own bullet. I see it as like the lens through which we look at all of the bullets.
Okay. Yeah, I understand that. That was me trying to bring them all into one bigger heading. But yeah, then that, opens it up. That makes our list longer, which is fine.
Well, can we, especially since there are a lot of folks who aren't here right now, can we, I guess you and I can work together on this, or, and then send it out to everybody. That's basically like, hey, this is a summary of what we were talking about, so that everyone has a chance to comment back on it and say, yes, this accurately reflects what said, or, I remember things a little differently, or I would really like to reemphasize this. And then, especially since we don't have everyone here, we can revisit this at the next meeting.
Yeah.
Does that sound like a plan to everyone?
Yeah, I can certainly, we'll have the minutes from the meeting, which obviously will help, but then I think you and I can work together, some sort of synthesis document that makes this maybe a little bit more digestible to everybody.
And I just want to add also that I think food insecurity should have its little area there too, because one of the things is we're going to get the increase in price of food, and also we talked about transportation, healthy local food, and if we don't have it in a place that people can readily get it, it won't be available. So as weather changes, we get increases in prices of food, and then we the availability tends to go down also.
It's also probably a good opportunity for us to look at food deserts and look at locations in town that may not have access to fresh produce, whether it's fresh grown here locally or whether it's just fresh, period.
And we can just call it healthy food.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know the local planning association and the health department worked on identifying those food deserts in our area maybe 2 years ago, not that long ago. So there's some good information out there on that.
Excellent. All right, it's 7 o'clock. Before we move, does anybody have anything to add before we move on from this topic? No, okay. So Forrest and I will work together to put together a list that summarizes and organizes what we've talked about here, send it back out to the CCAC, so everyone has a chance to look at it, to comment on it, and then we will revisit this at the next meeting to decide and actually kind of narrow it down, and get consensus. But it's 7:10. Do we all want to take a little 5-minute break before we move on to the next topic? Or do we want to push through?
I could stand a break.
All right, let's take 5 and then meet back here and we'll talk about the tasks, for the next steps for us.
Thank you.
Yep.
Cayman and Brandy, can you hang on just for a minute until I come back, just in case someone joins?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Forrest, did you get my message?
I'm looking at it now. Yep.
Okay,
Yeah,
awesome.
just hang out.
I don't know if it's a good sign when we all come back and we look more tired than when we left.
I have been on straight Zoom meetings since 11 o'clock today, 11 to 4 with no break between any Zoom because we're doing interviews for grad students. So it's just been a really long day.
That's Zoom overload. Oh, that's kind of brutal, actually.
Yeah, they forgot to tell the person scheduling the meetings to put a break between them. So we ended up cutting all the interviews to like 20 minutes so we could just like not for 5 minutes between people.
That poor last person.
There's actually been research on, I think it was on courts actually, like, is it better to be the first person in court or the last person in court? And what they found was that actually the worst person to be is the person right before lunch, I think, and right before you leave. Like that person is going to get short shrift no matter what, because everybody just wants to be done. So yeah, it probably is the same with interviewees. You don't want to be the one standing between, you know, the interviewing committee and lunch, or the interviewing committee and the end of the day.
Or the presenter.
Or
Yeah.
yes. I thought I saw Jennison back, but now she's not. Oh, hey, Jennison. All right. So the next agenda item is tasks. So I'm going to give this screen share thing another go and see if it does not cause my computer to revert to a weird monitor mirroring thing. Let's see. All right, let's see. All right, can y'all see it? Good, cool. All right, so last meeting we discussed, we basically, assigned ourselves to one of two teams, either the communications team or the technical advising team, with several folks sort of offering to be a secondary or backup on an additional team. So just to kind of remind us of where we are, this was the climate action planning process components. So we have listening and communicating, and that is really going to be sort of the focus of our communications team. And then we have those yellow items, the greenhouse gas inventory, the community resource inventory, the current policy analysis, and the vulnerability analysis are really the precursor components. We need to have those in place before we can really start having a rigorous discussion of mitigation, adaptation, and resilience actions. So our next steps are to develop and stand up the communications plan. Like, we need that before we can go anywhere else. We need to start engaging with the community, and we need to begin or advance work on those precursor components. So just as a reminder, for the teams, for communications, for their primary, team for Megan, Christine, Hannah, John, and Jennison is communications, with Amanda saying that she can sort of be a backup or secondary for communications if needed. Technical advising, myself, Stephen, Noah, Amanda, and then with Jennison and Hannah offering to be sort of backup or secondary on the technical advising team on their areas of expertise. So for the communications team, I think, and this is a conversation, right? So if you all disagree with me, please, say, hey, I think that we need to be doing something else instead, or something else first. But the way I'm looking at it, I think the first step is to get our communications plan up and running. So really discussing how are we going to engage with the community groups, with other advisory boards, and with the general public. The priority has to be getting this started now. So with COVID restrictions in place, how are we going to do that? But then also with an eye to the future when in-person gatherings will hopefully be possible. And we're really, with that communications plan, we're looking to do two things. We're looking to get input about people's current or future concerns, and we're also going to be seeking their feedback. So as we come up with things with as CCAC, as staff come up with things, we want to be able to bring those back out to the public and get their feedback on an ongoing basis. We also need to get started with that community resource inventory. I mean, that really dovetails in also with the communications plan. These are the folks that we want to be talking with. These are people or groups that could be resources for us and we're stakeholders. So city and county advisory boards, community organizations, municipal and private entities, and then also just sort of physical resources or example projects. There's something where it's going on in our community or in an adjacent community where someone is doing something really spectacular and we can learn from it, then I kind of put that as a resource as well. So this I started months ago, like back in the fall. I went through all the advisory boards and then I was sort of brain dumping community groups that I knew. Communications team can take this or leave this if it's helpful, like take what you want. If you don't, then no harm, no foul. Like I'm not going to take an offense, but I feel like maybe you wouldn't want to reinvent the wheel. So this is at least a listing of all of the city and county advisory boards, kind of lumped under general categories. And I'll send this out if you want to use it.
Megan, can we just add it to our Google Drive of all of our resources? Because regardless of anything, I think that's a useful list to have, period.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'll send out the graphic itself. It's unfortunately, it's an Illustrator file, like an Adobe Illustrator file, so it's not something super easy to work with. But yes, I will absolutely send the graphic to Forrest to put up. So that was communications. Actually, before we move on from that, the folks who are, especially the folks who are on the communications team, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think it looks good. I'd really like to have Christine to have this conversation, since I know she did a lot of work with community engagement and that sort of thing. One comment just to have in the notes, a really interesting communications plan someone shared with me for reaching community members who may not otherwise use the traditional pathways for communication was that they were sending information through food banks and including materials in the things people were picking up from food banks. And I think that is an interesting strategy that we should consider moving forward with this. You know, what other community social services are offered that people engage with on a regular basis that we may be able to reach out to individuals who may not be following us on social media or other places. They were doing that for take-home activities from a museum, and I just thought it was a wonderful way to reach community members who may not otherwise be served.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think we got to start thinking outside the box, right? And we already have an echo chamber. The folks who want to talk to us, who are already super engaged, it's wonderful, but we already have those channels. So yeah, the focus can be on finding those other channels. I guess we'll probably do this. Hopefully we'll have more attendance next time, but it would be really useful to have sort of a communications team lead. Megan, as vice chair, I was going to ask if you wanted to do it. But if you think that Christine, yes?
Let me talk to Christine, because I want to just make sure, you know, because my area is more of how to say things, whereas I think she's had a lot more experience in how to reach people. So I'm very open that if she feels so moved and would like to be head of this committee, I would like to allow her the opportunity to say so.
Sounds good. Well, I'll leave that. We can either have that conversation, I guess next time, but let you two have that conversation, really.
I did speak to Christine a little bit, and she was planning on sending me her priority areas and some feedback on this as well. So I expect her to get back to me here soon too.
Sounds good. Yeah, I guess if you want to, Megan, if you want to talk to Christine sort of directly, that can be done through Forrest once like that communication is open.
Or we can chat about it next time, unless we really need to hammer this out before our next meeting. But I'm happy either way, either to chair this committee or to invite Christine to do so, unless somebody else on the committee also feels super strongly that they'd like to do it.
I'm leaving it up to you all, like the communications team, to kind of work out amongst yourselves who you think would be the best person to take lead. So that, yes, that can be a conversation next time.
Great.
All right. So for the technical team, I thought what would make a lot of sense would be, once we narrow down what our sort of top 5 impacts are going to be, is for the technical team to work with staff, but really flesh out the components and really sort of dive into some more detail about, yeah, I mean, just making that vulnerability analysis a bit more detailed. So when we talk about housing and equitable housing, what does that mean? What are the things that we really need to be concerned about? What are the issues that we want to address? Really kind of diving into the literature to be able to define what we're talking about. And then, you know, if there are any estimates or constraints out there that we can be working with to get a better understanding of the scope of the issue. We talked about having like current policy analysis. So there's a bit of overlap with that in terms of looking at whether there are any current initiatives that address some of these issues or these concerns. So what's ongoing, what might we be able to sort of dovetail with? And then also, one of the comments from the Joint Policy Board was benchmarking was important. And so let's look at other municipalities and what they're doing and how they're thinking about and responding to these issues. And that, again, this will be part of the conversation really for next time as well, once we have a bit more clarity about what those impacts are going to be. And then for staff, really, you know, the current policy analysis. So what's on the table right now that are related to climate change? It doesn't have to be climate change, doesn't have to be in the title, but if it relates to climate change, to adaptation, to resilience, to mitigation, to greenhouse gas reduction, anything that you know is related to climate change would go into that current policy analysis. And then, you know, we mentioned it earlier, but then the greenhouse gas inventory. So I think that CCAC would really like to see a proposal for that. So it sounds like you all are going to be able to do it in-house, which is great. But letting us, you know, what is the scope that you're proposing? What's the timeline? Budget is really only relevant if it's a consultant, if it was something where we were going to need to go and talk to the Joint Policy Board and see if we could get money for it. If you all are able to do it in-house, then it's not so important. But really, I think the scope and the timeline. And then going forward, if we talked about doing this, you know, what are our top 5? The importance here is that this is an iterative process, that we are basically doing this in batches. And the reason for that is it allows us to have a fully integrated and continuous community engagement. It allows us to be responsive to new inputs and new situations and to make immediate and really nimble course corrections. So rather than trying to make a huge document all at once and having like a big listening section and then putting in thousands of hours of work and then going back and saying, hey, what do you think? And finding out that everybody hates it. We're gonna, you know, do this, you know, a few at a time. So I'm picked a number 5. It doesn't have to be 5, but you know, so this first priorities 1 through 5, the input is us, staff, and the community that's already engaging with us. So those who have come to the meetings and those folks that we have talked to outside of meetings. But then once we start putting this into practice, the development and the feedback is also going to come from the Joint Policy Board, and it's going to come through this comprehensive communications plan. So through this direct and sustained outreach and engagement with the community. And then the next set of priorities, the input for those is also going to be coming from the community, because then we'll be talking with everybody. We'll be able to ask them, what do you care about? What do you think needs to be next on the table? And then we're going to do it basically as an iterative process. So batch 1, batch 2, batch 3. And this is also in response to the Joint Policy Board, who said that they really want actionable suggestions from us as soon as possible. So this will allow us to start getting recommendations and suggestions to them and getting their feedback. And that iterative approach is basically this graphic, you know, this process that we'd already talked about. So each batch includes all of these phases. So the communications, listening and gathering, defining the situation, looking at all of, you know, greenhouse gas inventory, the vulnerabilities, current policies, what resources we're already working with, and then the sort of evaluation and planning, and then, you know, the prioritizing and acting, which is really the part where we send it off to the Joint Policy Board, make any refinements, and hopefully they'll be able to start putting some of this in action. So I see a couple of hands up. I don't know, Megan or Jennison, whoever went first. I see Jennison. Are you pointing at Jennison? All right, Jennison, you want to go first?
My question was about the previous slide, or related to the previous slide.
That one?
So yeah, and with our initial priorities, and of course it makes sense to start, we're starting with this group and those who've been engaged with us thus far. I guess my question is, I feel like we haven't done a broadcasting of this whole initiative and the whole fact that this committee exists yet, widely among the community members who may want to be involved but just aren't aware. And I wondered if that's something we can move up the timeline or priority list of, like, trying to get a certainly before April with Earth Day and Earth Week and month, and but I mean, just like a unified, coordinated kind of outreach push so that more people are aware that we're beginning, that we've been meeting, that we're going through this process and launching it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the communications component, we need to stand that out as soon as possible. Literally yesterday would have been great. If it seemed like there was pretty strong consensus about what those first items should be, which is why I was comfortable kind of saying, let's move forward with that. But if we feel strongly that we want to get more input before moving forward, I mean, one option would be, instead of having a top 5 that sort of we insularly came up with, we could maybe have a top 1 or 2 that we start working on and leave those other spaces sort of open to slot in once we really get the communications component going. I just don't, what I'm trying to avoid is us sitting here. If there's broad consensus that we know there are certain things that we're going to want to address, I want to give us the opportunity to get started on that, not to make them finalized in any way, but just get some momentum going so that as we bring on that communications, we can slot it in more as feedback. But
I don't want this to preclude or slow anything down. And maybe Forrest, you had your hand up. I wondered if there was going to be kind of concurrent, outreach to the general public, inviting more people to be engaged. So Forrest, maybe you could.
Yeah, if I can suggest, I think you all have made a lot of progress tonight laying out those initial priorities. I actually think that it might be helpful to run with those priorities, but also in that public outreach, let everyone know you've identified these priorities, but you want to open it up to add to these priorities. I imagine a lot of people in the community are going to have shared priorities. So you can move forward at the same time as opening up.
And the communications team, like, I'm serious. I put myself on technical advising. I'm obviously still chair of this committee, but in terms of communications, we have so many people with really fabulous experience and expertise in that area. So I want to let the communications team run with it. Get it started as fast as you can. Do what you all think is going to be the most effective way of communicating and getting that input and getting that engagement. So there's no, I mean, like that starts now. I don't think that we should wait at all.
Just a question about that first. Is there any restrictions that we would have about starting communications about what we're doing in such a way that it doesn't like accidentally become a meeting or something like that?
I think we would want to coordinate with the county communications staff, at least at first. And then also the city communications staff, if we're going to be, pulling both staffs in to deal with this, we'll want to get their feedback on that.
Great. Okay, so we will work on creating a plan and then reach out to them for the implementation of said plan.
Yeah,
or at least guidance.
I think that's a good idea. So far, the county communications staff have really been the main sort of communications entity on this one up to this point, putting the word out for the CCAC to be formed and things like that. So they are familiar with what's going on and are standing ready to do what's asked.
Great, thank you. And so Megan, my hand was originally up and sort of dovetails with what Jennison was saying, have we talked about bringing in somebody from the university's climate action plan? Because I know they had a listening session recently, which would be a good way to get an idea of what the county and city wants from us. But I think it would be worth us discussing how to bring someone in to join our meetings from who's ever doing that action plan on campus, because
So-
they're such a huge part of the county.
They are, so I used to work for the US Office of Sustainability, and they're the ones who are spearheading it. So I've been in touch with Matt Williams, who's the director over there. He had been listening in on our meetings for personal reasons. He hasn't been able to catch the last couple of them, but I am in contact with him, and we'll ask him to, I'm keeping that line of communication open, and I'm certainly happy to invite him formally in a formal capacity to this meeting. But yes, I absolutely agree. And the plan is to bring UF in on this, to make sure that our climate action plans communicate and that we work, collaboratively and work together and are aligned.
Forrest, do you want to go first?
See, Jennison
I use
and
that, and I
Forrest,
think, yeah.
you all just go, just
We were going to say the same thing probably, but
You're both
Forrest
muted,
and I are
though.
both on the. Am I muted? Can you hear me?
yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh yeah. So tomorrow actually we kick off the climate action plan at the university with working groups, and Forrest and I believe Steve Mulkey and John. I thought I saw your name on there too, but because we are all on the climate action plan team for the university, so as liaisons.
That's
I
even
guess we
better.
can't talk to each other in our working groups, and we're kicking it off like I'm on the energy working group, and I didn't see anybody else's name on this committee in that working group, so that's good. But
Yeah, yes. And if anybody has any questions about working together on that working group, please feel free to run them by me. But working for the state in that capacity has a lot more freedom and flexibility than maybe was communicated to us at some other meetings.
Great, well, good to know that we have some open lines of communication there, so you guys can report back and share with us. I would hate for us to end up in totally different places and make it harder for us to reconcile between the city, the county, and the university.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who are like Jennison, who are on US CAP sort of working groups, what is their timeline? Do you know yet?
I might have to look back at the invitation, but we haven't met yet. Like tomorrow's the first meeting we're having, so I don't know for sure.
Okay, I sat in, they did a listening session via Zoom like a month or so ago. I sat in on that, but wasn't aware kind of where they are. So, all right, well, maybe at the next meeting you could give us an update on how that first meeting went.
Absolutely, and if Stephen Mulkey's also on another working group, so I don't know if we're all going to meet collectively or with across, I'm not sure, so we'll find out tomorrow. But
it'd be really convenient if you all were on different working groups, and so you could just tell us what each one is doing.
yeah.
I think I have an idea of like their general timeline. So I wanted to apply to be in one of the working groups, but they said the time commitment, you would have to be working on the UF CAP until October. So I'm assuming things would be wrapping up around then.
Okay, that's actually a really quick timeline.
Yeah, I was surprised.
I'll look back at the invitation because she did lay out it. They did lay out a time commitment and timeline, I think, in that. So
Sounds good. Let's see if I can. Does anybody else want one of these slides back up, or can I stop the screen share? Yeah, all right. Cool. I've taken some notes on this presentation. I will send it to Forrest, and then Forrest, if you want to put the presentation up on our Dropbox site, and then I'll send that my sort of beta of the community inventory, resource inventory up there also. So does anybody, before we move on, does anybody have anything else to add on these, these first tasks or these first steps for the teams? No. All right. So I think the next, okay, this is sort of jumping ahead. So this is jumping ahead to item number 8, so just items for next meeting. Based on the conversation here, what do you all want to revisit or bring up anew in the next meeting? We had discussed earlier refining the priorities. So based on what Forrest sends out, sort of a consolidated list. So we'll revisit those priorities at the next meeting. I had some thoughts about like the communications plan. I feel like there's still benefit to the teams meeting together for a little while so really for us to understand what each other are doing. And so maybe give time at the next meeting for the communications plan discussion. The communications team really leads that discussion, but we have the tech team available if they feel like they really want to comment or just to be observers to understand what's going on. And then in terms of refining sort of the vulnerability analysis, which is going to be the tech team's first task, have a conversation about how to divvy that up because that's going to overlap with staff. So just really how we are going to accomplish that, how we're going to divvy it up. Those are sort of the 3 things that I had thought about. Does anybody else have thoughts for what to tackle at the next one? Nope. All right. Did you catch that for us?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So that brings us to public comment. And for the first time, it's not yet 8 o'clock and we're on to public comment. Yes. All right. So if there's any members of the public who would wish to speak, please raise your hand. And we're still trying to figure out whether you can unmute yourself or we have to unmute you. But if there are any members of the public who would like to speak, please raise your Zoom hand and then we'll call on you.
I see a couple of staff people and then
Of course, I can't hear you.
I see a couple of staff people and then David Moritz, for the chair of EPAC, but that's it.
All right, well, going once, going to, oh, hey, all right, David, I see you. Oh, you're gone.
Just saying hi.
Oh, just saying hi. Okay, well, hey. Yeah, thank you to you all who've been joining us each week. We really appreciate your comments, and we also just appreciate knowing that you're involved and that you're following what we're doing and are available, to collaborate with on this. So if we don't have any public comment, then that brings us to the end of our agenda and the end of 8 hours of Zoom for Megan Ennis. Thanks for sticking with us. Yeah, right. Thank you all. Our next meeting is going to be the Monday. It's going to be the 22nd, same time, 6 p.m. on Monday, and Forrest will send that out. So thank you all very much, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks all. Have a great weekend.
Yeah, you too.
Forrest, just wanted to remind you to, yeah, okay. All right. Do you want to end the recording, I guess, probably?
Oh yeah, good idea. Thanks, Brandy.